And I'd like to introduce Shonil Bhagwat from the University of Oxford in the UK. And it's very pleasing to see him here as he kindly stood in for Kathy Willis, who was due to give this talk but had to pull out at the last moment. So thank you very much. And we're going to hear you also talk about issues of conservation. Thanks.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this meeting. I'm going to talk about how the past can provide answers to the questions that are important for conservation of global biological diversity. And this is very much a team effort from Long-Term Ecology Lab. So I'll refer to the work of various colleagues, PhD students, postdoctoral researchers who have worked within the lab over the last 5 years or so. It has been suggested that conservation biology has developed into a bit of a science of documenting population decline, species losses, habitat destruction, all doom and gloom, but sadly doing little about it. And at this point, I should probably confess that I started as a conservation biologist and then turned into a palaeoecologist and saw the potential of palaeoecology to inform how conservation should be done, or how conservation can be made more realistic, and how the insight from the past can help present and future conservation of biological diversity. So recently, Bill Sutherland and 43 other colleagues published a paper in journal Conservation Biology identifying 100 questions that are important for conservation of global biological diversity. And these questions were roughly divided into these 12 sections. And if we have a quick look at these 12 sections, then we can easily pick out some of those and say that palaeoecology does indeed have a potential of answering those questions. Ecosystem function and services, Rob just spoke about. Societal context and change, John Deering's own work has thrown a huge amount of light based on palaeoecological evidence into this area. Technological change, archaeologists have worked on various communities and on various continents looking at the effect of technological change. Climate change is very much at the forefront at the moment. So there are many areas where conservation biology can be informed through palaeoecology. And yet, on this paper, there was not a single co-author out of the 44 that had a background in palaeoecology. So why is this? And I'm going to try and ask this question. So palaeoecology is a bit of a time machine. We can go back in time and look at the baselines, look at complexity of ecosystems, look at dynamism of ecosystems, rates of recovery, resilience, thresholds, variability, potentially very important for conservation biologists. So I think it's time that we put conservation biologists into this time machine and give them a guided tour of palaeoecology and how it can inform conservation of biological diversity. So drawing on inspiration from President Barack Obama, I'm going to argue that yes, we can. Palaeoecology can make a substantial contribution to conservation of global biological diversity. It can unravel the processes behind pattern that we see in space. And it can provide insights into the management of global biological diversity. But I'm going to argue that we, as a palaeoecological community, must make our data more accessible to conservation biologists. I'm going to draw on a number of case studies distributed across the world in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, also covering the oceanic islands in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and Indian Ocean. And based on these case studies, I'm going to demonstrate how palaeoecology can make a contribution to real-world management of biological diversity. So baselines and natural ecosystem variability are of interest to conservation biology, to conservation of global biological diversity. Baseline is the ecosystem present before human influence became pronounced on the landscape. And the case study I'm going to use here is that of pine forests in Sierra de Manantlan Biosphere Reserve in Mexico. So pine forests are considered an early successional ecosystem in this biosphere reserve, and therefore the prevalent management of this ecosystem is to eradicate pine, and in the hope that this ecosystem will reverse into a late successional stage. But the question is this ecosystem driven by climate, or is it largely anthropogenic? So the palaeoecological record from this region suggests that the pine has undergone lots of ups and downs through the last 4,000 years. And on the left there, there's a clear dip in the pine pollen abundance. At the same time, what we find is that there is increase in cloud forest taxa, which is possibly related to high humidity. So rather than a human influence, anthropogenically driven increase or decrease in pine, it seems that climate has played a major role in fluctuation of pine over time. It's also clear from the trends in other species that climatic oscillations between 50 and 80 years duration are apparent in a number of lake sedimentary records from Mexico. They are thought to be linked to solar forcing, resulting in drought cycles at approximately 50 to 80 years interval. And several species show a cyclical pattern of rise and fall of 80 years through this time period of 4,000 years. So it really seems that these pine forests are natural, driven by climate, rather than anthropogenic, driven by human presence. So this then informs the management of this biosphere reserve and perhaps calls into question the eradication of pine and the extreme measures that are taken to manage this biosphere reserve. The second case study is from Madagascar. It looks at thresholds and resilience in ecosystems. So threshold is a point at which there is abrupt change in an ecosystem quality, property, or phenomenon. And resilience is the ability of ecosystem to absorb this disturbance until it reaches that threshold. So in Madagascar, a late Holocene sea level rise is very well documented in the literature. The sea level was as high as 2.5 meters above the present level, between 1,500 and 1,000 before present. So there are two coastal ecosystems that might have been affected by this sea level rise. And one ecosystem is the littoral forest, which is right at the coast, and the second is heather, erica-dominated matrix, which is on the dunes slightly further away from the coast. So in these two pollen diagrams from two adjacent sites, the dark green colored are tree pollen, the light green are grass and heath pollen. The dark blue is sea level surges, and the light blue is rainfall or periods of aridity looked at other way. So it seems that during the first period of marine surge, which is highlighted in light gray at the bottom of both pollen diagrams, there wasn't very much change in the ecosystem. The ecosystem was remarkably resilient despite the sea level rise, despite the marine surge. But during the next two surges, which are further at the top, it seems that the sea level surge was in fact accompanied by increased aridity. And it was at this point that the threshold reached, and the ecosystem went from one stable state into the other, in the case of Erica matrix. But it seems that the littoral forest was remarkably resilient despite this threshold event, despite the combination of marine surge and drought. So this then brings into question, why was littoral forest more resilient than Erica matrix, and what implications does this have for conservation management? So 3 possible reasons are that seawater influx might have been counteracted by aquifers in the soil. The second is that deep water intake by roots contributed to resilience of the littoral forest. And the third is that the connected canopies of littoral forest trees might have prevented these very tall storm surges and sea surges. So this then gives concrete information for climate change integrated conservation strategies in the ways in which we can adapt to climate change in order to conserve this critically important biodiversity. Littoral forest being identified as one of the priority areas within Madagascar for conservation. The third case study is about species migration in response to climate change. It has been suggested that species will have to migrate in response to climate change. Species will have to shift their ranges in response to climate change. And this shift can be either altitudinal or latitudinal. Now, this makes it necessary to understand how quickly can species migrate in response to the changing climate, given that adaptation can be much slower than migration. So the glacial history of Europe is very well documented in the literature. And it has been suggested that the 3 Mediterranean peninsulas acted as refugia for a large number of tree species during the last glaciation. However, increasingly, there is more fossil and genetic evidence coming through which suggests that, in fact, there were several small pockets or northerly glacial refugia located much further north than the Mediterranean peninsula. So what implications does this have for species migrations? And it seems that the rates of migration that are calculated based on assuming the southerly locations of many species are far lower than, are far higher than what they actually would be. So we did a back of the envelope calculation and tried to find out how far species can migrate between now and 2100, given what they have done during the, after the deglaciation in Europe started. And it seems that some of these rates are overly exaggerated, as much as 500 times than they would otherwise be. So this has several implications for climate change integrated conservation strategies. European trees have been routinely modeled using bioclimatic envelope approach. And the migration rates that have been assumed in these calculations are based on the southerly refugial locations. So it's important that climate modelers take into account this discrepancy and look at the real rates of migration rather than assumed rates of migration. The fourth case study is from the Galapagos. It's about biological invasions. And this project in the Galapagos tried to answer a number of questions. Most important is, when is an invasive not an invasive? And this is important for conservation of global biological diversity, because biological invasions are one of the major threats after land use and climate change that are likely to threaten the biological diversity. So quinine is a tree that has spread in Galapagos in a remarkably short time period. In these images from Santa Cruz Highlands, we can see that there is almost 12,000 hectares of quinine over the last 35 years. And this remarkable spread of quinine has essentially triggered some management activities within the Galapagos Islands, which include eradication of invasive species. But should this eradication strategy be applied for all species that are considered invasive? Or does one need to look back in time to see which species are really invasive and which species not? So in this study, it was found that at least 6 species out of the 60 documented doubtful natives or supposedly invasive species, at least 6 species showed presence through time going beyond, going back the arrival of humans to the islands. So it's essential that this one-size-fits-all management strategy of eradication will not work for all species. And therefore, it's important to take into account the past presence of species in these islands. The next case study is from the Tenerife in the Canary Islands, and it's to do with conservation and culture and the interaction between humans and the impact of humans on natural ecosystems. So the Canary Islands are rich in endemics and have a variety of forest types. The question is, what impact did human activities have on the development of these vegetation types? There are laurel forests, pine forests, and a number of other vegetation types, but the ones that are of most interest are Quercus and Carpinus forests. If one looks at the palaeoecological record, Quercus and Carpinus were abundant in the past. However, they are considered extinct today. In addition, several endemics, so-called endemic species in the Canary Islands appear to coincide with the first arrival of humans. So going back to the Quercus example, the botanical records suggest that there were collections made of Quercus canariensis, but it was often thought to be a mistake. But looking at the palaeoecological record where it's quite clear that Quercus was present in the Canary Islands over a long time period, much before the human arrival, and therefore the humans have had more impact on the landscape development in the Canaries than otherwise thought. The final case study is of tropical forest recovery in southwest India. This is a landscape which is intensively cultivated and has coffee plantations spread across the landscape. But embedded within these coffee plantations are sacred forest groves that are maintained by people because of their religious beliefs and traditions. So these groves appear to have been places of ancestor worship. And if one asks people how old are these groves, people say they have always been there. But there is very little documented evidence of how these groves came about, how long have they been there, and what caused their formation. So the long-term ecological record from this region suggests that at one site, one sacred grove site that we code, the charcoal record was prominent, suggesting that this might have been a shifting cultivation landscape. But as the charcoal and grass started to decline, forest recovery at this site started, and open forest taxa were gradually replaced by closed forest taxa into an equilibrium state. So it seems that the recovery of this forest happened within a time span of 200 years, suggesting that tropical forests probably recover much faster than otherwise thought. Similar evidence has come about from other places on the Earth, and often these suggest very rapid tropical forest recovery, questioning the assumption of pristineness of forests. So what implications does this have for practical management? One implication is that we probably are dealing with novel ecosystems. We might not have pristine forest any longer, given that more than 80% of the Earth's land surface is inhabited or dominated or used in some form by humans. So the management should really focus on managing novel ecosystems rather than creating more so-called wilderness areas. Also, if we look at the socioeconomic information, probably only 15% of the land on the Earth can be realistically protected within protected areas. So we really need to move beyond protected areas in order to conserve global biological diversity. So how do we make paleoecological data more accessible to the wider conservation biology community? And the databases is an obvious way of doing that. But also what is important is to present our data in a more accessible format. So a simple thing to do will be to turn the axis around. And if I remember my own conservation biology days, I would be very perplexed about these pollen diagrams, which look sort of back to front and upside down. But if we turn the axis around, then it becomes much easier to access this data for a conservation biologist. So in conclusion, I have argued that paleoecology can provide answers to questions of importance to conservation of global biological diversity. Long-term understanding of ecosystems can provide insight into processes behind patterns. And finally, such insight can directly inform conservation management of biological diversity. Thank you.
Thanks, Shonil. Although I recall earlier in the week we were told we should run our diagrams with time running from left to right, but I think the point's taken. Any questions? Where's our person with the thermometer? Here she is over here.
So there's been a lot of great work done on the floral communities. Is there any work being done on any faunal communities at all?
Not in the long-term ecology lab at the moment, but there is archaeological information on faunal communities that is accessible, but hasn't been used to that extent by the conservation biology community.
Any other questions? Yep, there's one there.
You showed some data from southern India about the charcoal and the age determination. What is the methodology used to date it?
It's AMS radiocarbon date. And it's a preliminary data. We have 2 radiocarbon dates on it at the moment, but we are hoping to get more on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.